25 of the finest safecrackers alive walked out of that house with their heads down. Not one of them lasted an hour. The last man to try, a Dutch cryptographer who charged $200,000 for an evening's work, left his instruments on the floor where he dropped them and did not look back. And then a 26-year-old housemaid with a polishing cloth in her hand walked up to the vault they all called unbreakable. She opened it in 58 seconds. What she said afterward left the most feared man in New York standing perfectly still, unable to speak a single word. The study beneath the Romano estate had been built for one purpose: to hold things the world was never meant to find. It sat 40 feet under the lawns of a walled property in the Hamptons, past 2 steel doors and a stairway of poured concrete, and in 31 years, no federal agent, no rival, and no reporter had ever set eyes on it. The walls were paneled in walnut. The floor was covered by a Persian rug worth more than most houses. There was a grandfather clock in the corner, with a brass pendulum that swung with the patience of something that had watched a great many men make a great many mistakes. On this particular night in late October, the room smelled of cigars, cold espresso, and fear. Alexander Romano stood at the head of the long mahogany table, with both hands braced on its edge. He was 32 years old and had been head of the family for exactly 9 months, since the morning they lowered his father into the ground at St. Michael's and handed him an empire he had not asked for and could not refuse. He was not a large man, but he had the kind of stillness that made large men careful. Dark hair, gray eyes, a charcoal suit cut by a tailor in Milan who had cut suits for his father and his grandfather. He rarely raised his voice. He had learned young that a man who has to shout has already lost the room. Tonight, a vein stood out at his temple, and he had not blinked in nearly a minute. He was looking at the far wall. Set into 8 feet of reinforced concrete was a door of blued steel, 10 inches thick, framed in hand-finished brass. It had no keypad. It had no dial in the ordinary sense. No numbers, no notches, nothing a man could count. Instead, its face carried 3 concentric brass rings, and every inch of those rings was engraved, phases of the moon on the outermost, musical notation on the middle, and constellations spiraling inward toward a sunburst at the center, its rays as fine as the ribs of a leaf. It looked less like a vault than like the face of a very old clock that had been dreaming. The family had a name for it. They had used the name so long that most of them had forgotten it was a joke to begin with. They called it the Leviathan. "Tell me again, doctor," Alexander said. His voice was quiet. Everyone in the room leaned in a half-inch without meaning to. "Tell me again why a man who charges $200,000 an hour cannot open a metal box." Dr. Henrik Vanderberg was sweating through a shirt that had cost him 400 euros. He had breached systems that governments still pretended did not exist. He had spent 35 years in the trade and had never, not once, walked away from a door. His hands shook as he packed the sonic scanner into its foam case. "Mr. Romano," he wiped his forehead with a handkerchief that had gone gray with damp. "I beg you to understand what you are looking at. This is not a safe. It is not a digital lock. There is no code in it, because there are no numbers in it. There are always numbers. Not here." The Dutchman's voice cracked. "The escapement runs on sidereal time, star time, not clock time. It gains 4 minutes a day on the calendar in your kitchen. Behind the brass there is a sealed vacuum chamber, and behind that, a pressure trigger. It is a horological instrument, sir. It was not built by an engineer. It was built by an artist, and I would give a great deal to know who." Alexander pushed himself upright from the table. "My father," he said, "kept the physical ledgers behind that door, the account keys, 30 years of correspondence with men who currently hold public office on the eastern seaboard. A federal grand jury is executing a subpoena on this property in 48 hours. If what is inside that vault is still inside that vault when they arrive, the Romano family ends, not weakens, ends." He took 1 step toward the Dutchman. "You are the 25th expert to stand where you are standing and tell me the word impossible. Because it is." Vanderberg backed toward the stairs, clutching his case to his chest like a shield. "And there is worse. There is a dead man's switch. The interior is lined with magnesium ribbon and thermite charges. 3 failed sequences, and the pins drop, and everything inside becomes ash in 11 seconds. Everything, Mr. Romano. Paper, drives, film, ash. The room went very quiet. The Russian your people flew in yesterday dropped the first pin, the Dutchman said. The Englishman this morning dropped the second. You have 1 attempt left in the whole life of this machine, and if I touch that dial and I am wrong by the thickness of a hair, I will burn your family's history in front of you, and you will kill me for it. And I have grandchildren. He was crying by the end of it. Nobody in the room enjoyed watching it. Get out, Alexander said. The Dutchman got out. Nobody noticed the young woman kneeling on the rug by the sideboard. That was the entire point of her. Her name was Clara Hayes. She had been employed in the household for 3 months and 11 days as a maid on the East Wing, and in that time she had learned the first rule of service in a house like this one, which is not written down anywhere, and does not need to be. See nothing, hear nothing, be nothing. She wore the gray uniform they gave her, starched so stiff at the collar it left a red line on her neck by evening. Her auburn hair was pinned back in a bun so plain it was almost a statement. She kept her eyes on the floor, and her voice below the level of the room, and in 3 months not one man in that house had asked her a single question about herself. She had come down at 9 o'clock with a cloth and a bottle of neutral cleaner, because Dr. Vanderberg, in his agitation, had knocked over a cup of espresso onto a rug that was 200 years old, and Carmine had barked at somebody to send the girl. So the girl came, and the girl stayed, kneeling, working the stain in slow circles, invisible as a lamp, because Clara Hayes had wanted to be in this room for 3 months and 11 days, and she was not going to waste it. She had watched all of them. She had watched the Silicon Valley man with the aluminum briefcase, who talked for 40 minutes about entropy and left after 9. She had watched the old safecracker from Baltimore with the sandpapered fingertips, who put his ear to the door and then crossed himself. She had watched the Russian and the Englishman drop the 2 pins, and she had felt each one land in her chest like a stone into a well. She had heard them all complain about the same thing, that the face of the vault made no sense, that it was decorative, that it was a rich man's vanity, moons and notes and stars, and that somewhere behind all that nonsense there had to be a real lock, if only they could get to it. Every one of them was wrong, and Clara had known it from the first night, because Clara had seen that sunburst before. Not in a book, not on a forum. She had seen it in pencil, on tracing paper, in the 11th hour of a winter night in a small flat in Clerkenwell, London, with the rain hitting the window and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, while a man with ink on his knuckles explained to a 9-year-old girl why a gear with an odd number of teeth wears more evenly than a gear with an even one. Her father's name was Thomas Hayes. He had trained in Geneva, in the archives, among the old grand complications, the kind of watches that track the moon and the tides and the position of the stars, and lose 1 day of accuracy every 4,000 years. He had been, by the estimate of men who did not hand out compliments, one of the 4 or 5 finest horologists alive. He had also been a gambler. That was the crack that ran through the whole of him. Clara had grown up in a house where the furniture kept changing, where a man would knock on the door at odd hours, and her father would go into the hall and speak quietly, and come back smiling too widely. And then, one night 5 years ago, in the small hours, 3 men came who did not knock. She was 21. She stood at the top of the stairs in her nightclothes, and watched them take him out the front door in his slippers. He looked back at her once. He did not look afraid. That was the part she could never explain to anyone. He looked at her the way a man looks at a clock he has just wound, as if to say, "You'll keep going now. That's all I need." There was no ransom. There was no body. The police filed it, and the file grew cold, and the flat was sold to pay what he owed, and Clara Hayes went out into the world with nothing but a tool roll of her father's smallest files and 5 years of patience. She learned to listen in the places where people talk: pawn shops, auction previews, the back rooms of watch fairs in Basel and Geneva and New York, where certain dealers handle certain estates and do not ask certain questions. She heard a rumor about a commission, a vault, not a watch, American money, a family in New York. It took her 3 years to put a name to the family. It took her 4 months after that to get herself hired as a maid on the East Wing. And now she was kneeling 10 feet from a brass sunburst she had watched her father draw, and the man who owned it had just given the order to cut it open with a thermal lance. "Carmine." Alexander's voice cut across the room. "Bring up the lances." Carmine Ricci had been the family's underboss for 11 years, and Alexander's father's driver for 19 before that. He was built like a loading door, 61 years old, with a scar through one eyebrow he had never explained to anybody. He was not a man who frightened easily. He hesitated. "Boss," he said it carefully. The Dutchman said, "Thermite. We put heat on that door. The magnesium goes. We lose the ledgers, we lose the keys, we lose the letters. We lose everything your father spent 30 years. Then, what would you have me do?" Alexander's control broke for exactly 1 second. He swept a crystal decanter off the table with the back of his hand, and it burst against the wall, and the sound of it went through the room like a shot. Amber whiskey ran down the paneling. Glass skittered across the rug and came to rest 6 inches from Clara's knee. She flinched and pressed the polishing cloth against her chest and did not look up. Alexander breathed once, twice. When he spoke again, he was quiet. 25 of the best minds in the world," he said, "beaten by a door built by a ghost nobody can name. We have 39 hours. If it burns, and we go into that courthouse with nothing, and we take what comes. Bring the lances." Carmine turned for the stairs, and Clara Hayes looked at the broken glass by her knee and thought about her father's hands. She could see them exactly, the 2 calluses on the right index finger, the way he held tweezers like a violinist holds a bow, the way he would stop mid-sentence and go still for a full minute because something in the mechanism had spoken to him and he was listening. "A lock is not built to keep people out, Clara," he used to say. "Any fool can weld a box shut. A lock is built to wait. It waits for the one person in the world who knows the right question, and when that person comes, it opens like a door in a friend's house." She had been 11 years old. She had thought it was a nice thing to say. She understood now that it had been a set of instructions. Clara stood up. Her knees were shaking so badly that she had to put one hand on the sideboard, and she was not aware of having decided anything at all. "You can't cut it open," she said. Her voice was not loud. In a room that size, it should have vanished. Instead, it landed like a dropped plate in a church. Every head turned. Carmine's hand went inside his jacket on pure reflex. 2 men at the door came off the wall, and Alexander Romano turned around slowly, the way a man turns when he thinks he has misheard something, and looked at her the way you would look at a chair that had just cleared its throat. "What did you say?" Clara's mouth had gone dry as paper. She made herself lift her chin. "I said you can't cut it open, Mr. Romano." A breath. "Not because of the heat, because of the pressure. There's a vacuum chamber behind the brass faceplate. The accelerant is held in glass ampules inside that chamber, and the seal is what holds them intact. The moment you pierce it, the outside air comes in at 14 pounds a square inch, and it crushes them. The thermite ignites before your lance is through the second layer of steel. You won't lose the ledgers slowly, sir. You'll lose them in the first 11 seconds, and then you'll be standing in a sealed room 40 feet underground with a magnesium fire." Nobody moved. The grandfather clock in the corner went on with its work, unimpressed. Alexander crossed the rug. He stopped closer to her than any man in that house had stood in 3 months, and he looked at her, at the cheap black shoes, at the gray uniform, at the polishing cloth still crumpled in her fist. "Who are you?" "Clara," her voice held. "I clean the East Wing." "Girls who clean the East Wing," he said, "do not know the vapor pressure of a sealed chamber." "No, sir, they don't." "Then I will ask you once more, and I want you to think very carefully about your answer." He did not raise his voice at all, and somehow that was worse. "Who are you?" Clara looked past his shoulder at the brass sunburst on the wall. "Someone who can open your vault," she said. Carmine laughed out loud, a hard, disbelieving bark. "Boss, the kid's lost her nerve, that's all it is. People say crazy things when they're scared. Let me walk her upstairs, put her in a car." "Quiet." Alexander had not looked away from her. He was reading her face the way he read men across a table, for the tell, for the wire, for the hesitation of somebody sent by somebody else. He had been reading faces since he was 14 years old and had rarely been wrong. What he found in this one was not fear exactly. It was underneath fear. It looked like a woman who had walked a very long way and had just arrived. 25 men, he said, with degrees, with records, with reputations. Every one of them failed. And you're telling me you can do it. They failed because they tried to solve it, Clara said. Meaning? Meaning they treated it like a problem. She stepped past him. She felt the guard's attention swing with her like a compass needle, and she kept walking anyway, until she was standing in front of the door. It isn't a problem, Mr. Romano. It's a piece of music. Somebody wrote it, and the only way in is to play it back to him. She stopped a hand's width from the brass. Up close, the work was almost unbearable. Every ray of the sunburst was chased by hand. The moon on the outer ring was not a symbol but a portrait, cratered, faintly shadowed, exactly as it hangs over a city at 4 in the morning. There was a maker's habit in the engraving that she would have known blindfolded, a tiny hesitation at the top of every curve, where the graver lifted for a fraction of a second. Her father had a tremor in his right hand. It had been getting worse the year they took him. Clara pressed her lips together hard so that nobody in that room would see them shake. "You have 1 minute," Alexander said. He had come up behind her. She could hear him. "There is 1 attempt left in that machine. If you drop the 3rd pin, everything my family is burns to nothing while we watch. Do you understand what that would mean for you?" "I understand." "Then go." She did not use a stethoscope. She did not use a scanner or a light or a single tool. Clara Hayes raised both bare hands and laid them flat against the cold brass, the way you would put your palm on the flank of a horse you had known as a foal. Then she closed her eyes. Think, Clara, not how does it work. How did he think? The outer ring was the moon. Every man who had stood here had tried the obvious things, and she had heard them do it. They had tried the date of the commission. They had tried the old Don's birthday, his wedding, the day his first son was born. They had reasoned that a craftsman sets a lock to the client's calendar because the client is the man who has to open it. But her father had not built this for the client. He had built it in a locked workshop on somebody else's money, knowing what kind of men he was building it for, knowing that when it was finished, he would either be free or he would be finished. He had built it in the only language he had left, and a man in that position does not set his lock to his employer's birthday. He sets it to the one date he is never going to stop thinking about. Clara gripped the outer ring and turned it counterclockwise. It was heavier than it looked. It took her shoulder as well as her hands. Inside the door, deep in, she heard it. Clack, clack, clack. The long-toothed, unhurried sound of a train of gears older than any of the men in the room. She brought the ring around to a waning crescent, low in the house of Scorpio. The moon as it had hung over Clerkenwell, London, on the 17th night of November, 5 years ago, when 3 men who did not knock came up her father's stairs. A soft hiss came out of the door. Behind her, Alexander Romano drew a breath and held it. Carmine said something under his breath that was half a curse and half a prayer. "That's the vacuum seal releasing," Clara said, mostly to herself. "It's safe to cut now. It's just that we won't have to." 22 seconds. The middle ring was music. The Dutchman had photographed it and run it through pattern software for 3 hours and concluded it was a randomized cipher meant as a decoy. It was not a decoy. It was a piece of engraved staff notation, and the notes were not in a random order. They were in an order Clara Hayes had been hearing in her sleep since she was 6 years old. Her father hummed when he worked, always the same handful of bars, over and over, without ever once seeming to notice he was doing it. A slow, unhurried little phrase out of a Schubert nocturne, the kind of thing a man hums when the house is asleep, and the lamp is low, and the work is going well. She had hummed it herself in an empty flat for 5 years, alone, because it was the only recording of him she had. Her fingers found the engraved notes on the brass and pressed them in their proper order. E-flat, G, B-flat, C. And the Leviathan answered. Not a click, a chime, A single, resonant, low note that came up out of the steel and filled the room, the sound of a music box the size of an automobile, and it hung in the air of that concrete cellar for 3 full seconds before it faded. Somebody by the door said, "Madonna." "Unbelievable," Alexander said. He did not seem to know he had said it aloud. 41 seconds. The center. The sunburst would not move. 2 of the 25 had put torque wrenches on it, and one of those 2 had dropped a pin doing it. It was locked solid and there was no keyhole anywhere on it, and that was the wall every man had broken himself against. Clara ran the pad of her thumb slowly around the outside of it, ray by ray, feeling. There. On the lowest ray, at the very edge, so shallow you would never find it with your eyes, and never notice it with a glove on. A dimple. Not a keyway, not a screw. Just a small polished depression, about the size and shape of the ball of a thumb. Her father used to press his thumb against a caseback exactly like that when he was thinking. "It isn't a lock," Clara said quietly. "It's a handshake." She set her thumb into the dimple and pressed hard, and at the same time took the outer edge of the sunburst in her other hand and turned it a quarter turn counterclockwise. Not forcing it, asking it. Clack. Then a sound like a ship's engine turning over. 8 steel bolts, each as thick as a man's forearm, withdrawing all at once into the frame. Whir, thunk. The Leviathan groaned and swung outward 1/2 inch and let out a breath of cold, dry, 31-year-old air. 58 seconds. For a moment, nobody did anything at all. Then the room came apart in noise. Carmine got to the door first and hauled it wide, and the men crowded behind him, and there it all was on the steel shelves inside. The leather ledgers in 3 rows, the hard drives in their foam cases, the bearer bonds in banded stacks, the flat gray archive boxes of correspondence. Untouched, every page of it. The Romano family had been 60 seconds and 1 wrong guess from ending, and it was not going to end. Alexander Romano did not look at any of it. He was looking at the maid. She had lowered her hands and stepped back from the door, and now that it was over, she seemed to shrink. A small woman in a gray uniform with a polishing cloth still balled in her left fist, standing in front of 10 inches of steel, shaking hard enough to see from across the room. He crossed to her. He did not touch her. He stopped a respectful pace away and stood there, and for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Romano could not find a word to put in his mouth. "Nobody," he said at last, and his voice came out rough, "walks up to a ghost's masterpiece and takes it apart in under a minute. That isn't skill. Skill gets you the vacuum seal. Skill does not get you a lullaby." Clara said nothing. "You didn't open a lock," he said. "You answered a man." He watched her face, and he saw it. The thing she had been holding down since the moment she stood up off that rug. Her eyes had gone bright, and she was blinking too fast, and she was losing. "Who was he to you?" Alexander asked. And Clara Hayes, who had spent 5 years being nobody in order to stand in this room, finally said it out loud. "He was my father." The word went through the cellar like a change in the weather. Carmine Ricci came away from the vault door with his hand already inside his jacket. "Boss?" He had the flat, careful voice of a man who has made this exact argument before and been right. "She's a plant. 3 months in this house, and she happens to know the door. Falcone put her here, or the bureau did. Either way, she walks out of this cellar knowing what's on those shelves, and if she walks out, that's the end of us. Put it away, Carmine. I'm telling you what your father would say. Put it away." Alexander did not shout often. When he did, it was like a shelf coming down. Carmine's hand came out empty, and the underboss took a step backward, and the 2 men at the door found something else to look at. Alexander turned back to Clara. "Slowly," he said. "All of it." So she told him. She told him her name, Clara Hayes, 26 years old, born in London, no criminal record, no employer beyond this one, no wire, no handler, nothing. She told him about Geneva and the archives and the grand complications. She told him about the gambling, said plainly, without dressing it up, because there was no point pretending her father had been a saint. She told him about a night in November 5 years ago, and 3 men on the stairs, and a look back from the front hall. She told him about 5 years of pawn shops and auction previews and back rooms in Basel, and a rumor about an American commission, and how long it had taken her to attach a family name to that rumor, and how she had gotten herself hired to clean the East Wing. "I never touched anything in this house," she said. "I never photographed a document. I never copied a key. I never spoke to a soul about what I saw here. You can pull every phone record I have. I came for one thing." Her voice finally went. "I came to find out what your family did with my father." Alexander listened to the whole of it without interrupting once. Then he said quietly, "And you believe we killed him? I know how it works." She was crying now and she hated it, and she kept talking anyway. "He built you something that cost $5 million and could never be duplicated and could never be explained. Men like you don't leave a witness holding the drawings. He built the Leviathan and then he stopped existing, and I have spent 5 years scrubbing other people's floors to be standing in this room saying it to your face." Carmine shifted. Alexander lifted 2 fingers and Carmine went still. "I want justice," Clara said. "I just saved everything you have. That's what I want in exchange." For a long moment, Alexander Romano looked at her. Then he did something none of his men expected. He walked into the vault. He went past the bonds, past the ledgers, past the drives that 39 hours from now would decide whether he spent his life in a federal facility, and he crouched at the bottom shelf and lifted out a small armored lockbox. He opened it with his thumbprint. He came back out carrying a manila envelope, and he set it on the mahogany table and slid it across the polished wood until it stopped in front of her. "You are the most intelligent person who has been in this room in 9 months, he said, "and you are wrong about nearly everything." Clara opened the envelope. It was a surveillance photograph, long lens, printed large. A workshop, low ceiling, no windows, concrete, a single steel door in the background with a keypad beside it. A workbench under the hard white circle of an adjustable lamp, and on that bench, laid out in the obsessively straight rows Clara would have known anywhere, a horologist's tools. And bent over the bench, a loop screwed into his right eye, was a man with completely silver hair. He was thinner. He was older by more than 5 years. There were deep lines cut down either side of his mouth that had not been there before, and his shoulders had gone round the way a man's shoulders go when he has spent too long over close work in bad light. But it was his hands. It was the way he held the tweezers, like a bow, and propped against the lamp base, angled toward him, the way a man positions a thing he needs to look at all day so he does not lose count, was a newspaper. Clara's fingers went to it. The date was legible. It was 3 weeks old. The sound she made was not a word. "He's alive," she said. He's alive. He is alive." Her legs stopped holding her. Carmine, of all people, got a chair under her before she went down, and then stood there looking uncomfortable about having done it. "My father was a hard man, Miss Hayes," Alexander said. He sat down on the corner of the table, so that he was not standing over her. "I am not going to tell you he was anything else, but he kept his word, because in his mind, that was the only thing that separated him from the animals. He paid your father the $5 million in full. He gave him documents in a new name, and a car to Teterboro, and a chartered aircraft to a country with no extradition treaty, and instructions never to contact this family again. Then why? Because Thomas Hayes never reached the aircraft." Alexander let that sit. The car was stopped on a service road 11 minutes from the field. The driver was one of ours. He spent 4 days in an intensive care unit and could not tell us much. Your father was gone by morning. My father spent 2 years and a great deal of money trying to find out where, and the answer, when it came, was a name he had been trying not to say out loud for a decade. Who? Dominic Falcone. The name landed strangely in the room. Carmine looked at the floor. The 2 men at the door looked at each other. "Falcone runs the only organization in this city that my family has never been able to reach an accommodation with," Alexander said. "Not because of territory, because of what he does. My father was a criminal, Miss Hayes, and he made no apology for it, and there were still doors in this city he would not walk through. Falcone walks through all of them. And he wanted a vault. He wanted this vault." Alexander nodded at the Leviathan, standing open behind them like an exhibit. Word got out. It always does. Somewhere in the trade, a man drank too much and told a story about a door in the Hamptons that could not be opened by machine or by mathematics. And Dominic Falcone decided he had to have one, and there was exactly one man in the world who could build it. Clara looked down at the photograph, at her father's rounded shoulders, at the loop in his eye. 5 years, she whispered. 5 years in a room underground, building locks for a man who will kill him the day he finishes the last one. Alexander's voice was flat. Your father is not a prisoner, Miss Hayes. He is a resource, and resources get used up. She put her hand over her mouth. We have known he was alive for over 2 years, Alexander said. We have never known where. Not the borough, not the block. Falcone moved him at least twice. Clara raised her head. Then what changed? You said I was wrong about nearly everything. What's the nearly? For the first time that night, something moved at the corner of Alexander Romano's mouth that was almost, but not quite, a smile. He reached into the envelope again and drew out something heavy, a leather-bound journal, cracked at the spine, the corners soft with handling. This changed, he said. He set it on the table in front of her. 2 years ago, a guard on Falcone's payroll decided he had seen one thing too many and went looking for a door out. He brought this to my father in exchange for passage and a name change. It was the last piece of business my father ever conducted, and 11 days later he had a stroke at his own kitchen table, and I inherited a war I did not know I was in. Clara opened the journal. Her breath caught in her chest and stayed there. Page after page of it. The narrow, forward-leaning hand she had learned to read before she could read print. Exploded views of escapements. Gear trains in 3/4 section. Margins crowded with arithmetic, with tiny sketches of hands and levers, with the same 3-word note her father had scrawled on everything he ever made. Check the wear. She turned a page and had to stop and press the heel of her hand against her eyes. He wrote check the wear on my school reports, she said. As a joke, when I was 10. Nobody said anything. It is coded, Alexander said, when she had steadied. Every man I trusted with a photocopy of 6 pages told me the same thing. It is a technical notebook, and technically it is meaningless. The dimensions do not build anything. The tolerances are absurd. My own people concluded the man was writing nonsense to keep himself sane. Clara turned another page. Then another. She had gone very still, and her breathing had changed. They were nonsense, she said, to anybody who thought he was designing a vault. She turned the journal around and pushed it across the table. Look at this gear. Alexander looked. It was a large cog, drawn in careful section, annotated with a column of numbers running down the right margin. A gear that size, Clara said, in that train, with that escapement, would have a module, a tooth ratio, of about 2, maybe 2.5. He's written 40.713. That isn't a ratio. There is no machine in the world with that ratio. It wouldn't turn. It would seize. Then it's an error. It's a latitude. She flipped forward 2 pages, ran her finger down another column. And here, a bearing clearance of -74.01. Clearance cannot be negative. It's a physical impossibility. And my father was not a man who made that kind of mistake twice, let alone 600 times. Her voice was rising, steadying, the tears drying on her face. 40.7, -74.0. Mr. Romano, that's Manhattan. Alexander went very still. He wasn't designing a vault at all, Clara said. Or, he was, but that's not what this is. Falcone put a master craftsman in a room and gave him paper and told him to work, and he never once considered that the paper was the danger. My father spent 5 years drawing a map. Every time they moved him, he wrote down where they moved him to, in the one language nobody in that building could read. She looked up. He was leaving a trail for whoever came looking. He was leaving it for me. He knew I'd know a bad ratio when I saw one, because he's the one who taught me. The cellar was silent except for the grandfather clock. Then Carmine Ricci, 61 years old, underboss of the Romano family, who had wanted to put this woman in a car and drive her somewhere quiet 40 minutes ago, said in a low voice, Madonna Santa. Can you read all of it? Alexander asked. I can read all of it, Clara said. Give me a night. By 2 in the morning, the estate was locked down, and the contents of the Leviathan were in 3 armored vehicles headed for a bonded facility in New Jersey that the family had held under a shell company since 1974. Whatever the grand jury found in the Hamptons in 37 hours, it was going to be a great deal of empty steel. Alexander took Clara to the city. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building near Bryant Park, glass on 3 sides, the skyline standing up all around it like something built to be looked at rather than lived in. There were paintings on the walls that Clara recognized from a book. There was a kitchen nobody had ever cooked a meal in. She stood in the middle of it in her gray uniform and her cheap black shoes, and felt like a woman who had wandered onto a stage. Alexander came out of the study with his jacket off, sleeves turned back, carrying 2 mugs. Not crystal, mugs. "Tea," he said. "My mother's answer to everything. I am told the English find it medicinal." Clara laughed, one wet, startled sound, the first laugh out of her in what felt like a year, and took it. "There's a room made up down the hall," he said. "There are clothes in it. My sister keeps things here, and you are close enough to her size, and before you argue with me, you have been on your feet since 6 o'clock this morning. You have been crying, and you are still wearing a uniform issued to you by a household you no longer work for. Get out of it. I'm not tired. You are exhausted. You simply have too much adrenaline in you to know it." He set his mug down. "Miss Hayes, 2 hours ago you were the help. As of tonight, you are the only person on this earth who can read that journal, which makes you the most important individual in my organization, and I do not intend to work you into the ground in the first 12 hours. Go and change, then come back and we'll begin." She came back 20 minutes later, in a plain cream sweater and dark trousers, her hair down for the first time in 3 months, and Alexander Romano looked up from the coffee table and for a half-second forgot the sentence he was in the middle of. He recovered. He gestured at the chair opposite. "Begin," he said. They worked until the windows went from black to gray to a thin, cold gold. Clara worked the way her father had worked, and the way she had watched him work at that table in Clerkenwell, with a pencil, a straight edge, and long silences. She built a key first, a list of every impossible number in the journal, sorted by the kind of measurement it pretended to be. Ratios were latitudes. Clearances were longitudes. Case depths in millimeters were floor levels below street grade, and she wept for a minute when she worked that out, because there were pages where the number was 7. Alexander did not speak while she was reading. When she needed something, he got it. Twice he refilled her tea. Once, near 4 in the morning, she surfaced and found a plate of toast beside her elbow, and no memory of anyone putting it there. By 6:30, she had 11 sets of coordinates in chronological order across 5 years, and when she plotted them on a paper map of Manhattan, they told a story that made Alexander sit forward with both elbows on his knees. "Bushwick," she said, touching the first. Then Sunset Park, then Long Island City. He stayed there almost 2 years. Look at the density of the entries. He had time to be careful. Then a jump. Then here. Her finger stopped and stayed, and he never moves again. 14 months in one place. Alexander looked at where her finger was. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and stood with his back to the room for a long moment. "Do you know what's at that address?" he said. "No." "Cipriani, Wall Street." He turned around. "It was a bank once, 1840s. The vaults are still down there. The old chambers, 4 levels of them, cut into the bedrock. Falcone bought the building through a hospitality group 6 years ago and spent a fortune on the restoration. And everybody in this city thought it was vanity. He was building around him," Clara said. He was building around him. Alexander's face had changed. There was something in it now that had not been there in front of the vault. And in 9 days he is hosting 500 people there. Black tie, charity auction, or that is the story on the invitation. In practice, it is the one night a year. Every account he cannot explain gets shaken out and put back together in front of witnesses, too respectable to ever be asked about it. And you're invited. Every family in the Northeast is invited. It is a demonstration. He likes us to see how comfortable he has become. Alexander came back and sat down across from her. I have had that invitation on my desk for 3 weeks, and I had every intention of sending regrets. Clara looked at the map, at the small pencil cross she had drawn 7 levels under a marble floor. 9 days, she said. 9 days. Then we don't go in through the wall, Clara said. We can't. If we breach anything, anywhere, Falcone will have a switch and my father will be dead before anyone gets down a stairwell. Men like that always have a switch. My father would have built it himself and hated every minute of it. Agreed. So we walk in through the front door, she said, wearing very expensive clothes, and we take him out past 500 witnesses in black tie, and Dominic Falcone can't fire a shot or raise his voice because the mayor's finance chair is standing by the oysters. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. You have done this before, he said. I have never done anything before in my life. Then it is a great pity you started so late, he said it dryly, and she laughed again, and it surprised them both. Then he set his mug down and leaned forward, and the lightness went out of him. I want to be honest with you, Alexander said, because I think you have had a great deal of dishonesty from people who owed you better. What I am about to propose is not a favor I am doing for you. There are 4 locked doors between the ballroom floor and the chamber where your father is, and I have seen the specifications on 2 of them, and no man on my payroll can get through any of them. You can. That is the arrangement. You are not being rescued, Miss Hayes. You are being recruited. I know. And there is a second thing, and it is worse, and you should hear it now rather than in a hallway underground. He held her eyes. I am not a good man. I have not decided to become one, because you cried in my cellar. I want Dominic Falcone finished for reasons that have nothing to do with your father, and if the 2 things had pointed in different directions tonight, I do not know which one I would have chosen. Clara held the mug in both hands and looked at him. But they don't point in different directions, she said. No, they don't. Then that's enough for me. She set the mug down. I've spent 5 years waiting for a good man to help me, and no good man ever did. The police filed him, the embassy filed him, 2 private investigators took my money, and one of them stopped answering the phone. You're the first person in 5 years who has shown me a photograph. She put out her hand across the table. Alexander Romano looked at it. Then he took it, once, firmly, the way men shake on a thing they intend to honor. There is a condition, he said, not letting go yet. When it is done, however it is done, you and your father walk. Out of this, out of my world, out of my name. New papers if you want them, and money if you'll take it, and nobody from this organization ever calls on you again. I will not spend the next 30 years using the most decent person I have ever met as a lockpick. Clara's throat closed. And if I'd rather stay, she said, then you will have made the first genuinely foolish decision of your life, Alexander said, and I will have 9 days to talk you out of it. He let go of her hand. Outside the glass, the sun came up over the East River and put a hard, bright line along the tops of the buildings, and somewhere 7 floors under a marble ballroom, a silver-haired man was waking up in a room without windows to begin another day's work on a door he had been designing very, very slowly. 9 days, Clara said. Then let's go and get my father back. They spent the 9 days the way her father would have spent them, on paper first and on hands last. Alexander bought the building plans, or rather he bought a clerk in a records office in Lower Manhattan who had a daughter starting at Fordham in the fall. What came back was a set of 1847 bank drawings, 4 levels of vault chambers cut into schist, and a 2019 renovation permit that showed 3 of those 4 levels filled with structural concrete. He didn't fill them, Clara said, tapping the permit. Look at the volume. He filed for 1,100 cubic yards, and the trucking manifests show 400. He poured the stairs shut and left the rooms. Which means the only way down is the service elevator behind the kitchen, and it only exists on the 2019 drawings as a dumbwaiter. Carmine Ricci, who had spent the first 2 days treating Clara like an unexploded shell, spent the next 7 treating her like a member of the family. It happened in a single moment on the 3rd afternoon, when she pushed a legal pad across the table to him and said, "You've walked more marble floors than I ever will. Where would you put a man you didn't want found?" And the old underboss stared at her, and then pulled the pad toward him and started drawing. He was the one who found the caterer. "Falcone uses the same outfit every year," he said. "Guy who owns it moved product for us in the 90s and got out clean. He owes this family nothing at all, which is exactly why he'll do it. He's the only man in that building who has no reason to be afraid of anybody." There were 4 doors between the ballroom and the chamber. Clara studied all 4 for 6 days out of photographs, permit filings, hardware invoices, and the last 40 pages of her father's journal, which turned out not to be a map at all but something far more useful, a maintenance record. He had been logging, in careful pretend engineering, every lock in that basement, its make, its weaknesses, its service dates, and in one entry that made Clara put her head down on the table for a full minute, the word deliberate beside a note about a misaligned pin in the 3rd door. He had built a flaw into it, 5 years ago, on the chance that somebody someday would read the book. "Your father," Alexander said, standing behind her chair, "is the most patient human being I have ever heard of." "He's a watchmaker," Clara said. "Patience is the whole job. Everything else is just filing." On the 7th day, a box arrived from a house on Madison Avenue, and inside it was a dress the color of deep water, and shoes, and a small hard case containing earrings that Clara handled like specimens. "I can't wear these." "You can and you will, because a woman at that party in anything cheaper will be looked at twice," Alexander said, "and being looked at twice is the only thing that can kill us." She stood in front of the mirror for a long time that night, in a dress that cost more than her father's last legitimate commission, and did not recognize the woman in it, and thought, 3 months ago I was on my knees with a cloth in my hand, and none of these people could have told you the color of my eyes. That, she understood now, had never been a weakness. It had been the reason she was still alive. Cipriani Wall Street on the night of the 18th was the most beautiful room in America. 60-foot Corinthian columns, a ceiling of coffered gold, 500 people under a chandelier the size of a small car, and a string quartet on the mezzanine playing something safe, and champagne moving through the crowd on silver trays in a slow, continuous tide. Dominic Falcone received his guests at the top of the marble steps. He was 71 years old, small, dry, immaculate, with a voice like a man reading a weather report. He shook hands with a bishop. He kissed the cheek of a woman who had once run a federal agency. When Alexander Romano came up the steps with a woman on his arm, Falcone's eyes went to her for exactly the length of time it takes to price a coat, and then away. "Alessandro," he clasped Alexander's hand in both of his. "Your father's chair has been empty at these things for a year. It's good. It's good that you came. It seemed like the year to come." "It is. It is." Falcone's smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "And you brought company. Miss Hayes advises me on acquisitions." "Does she?" Falcone looked at her properly then, 1 flat second, the way a man glances at a number he does not need. "Acquisitions? What sort?" "Instruments mostly," Clara said. "Antique ones. I'm told nobody in this city knows anything about them." "You are told correctly," said Dominic Falcone, and lost interest completely, and turned to the ambassador behind them. It was, Clara thought, walking down into the noise and the gold on Alexander's arm, with her heart going like a hammer, the single most useful thing that had happened all week. He had looked directly at her and filed her under nobody. She had spent 5 years training for exactly that. At 9:40, a young man in catering whites bumped a tray near the west service door, and there was a small wet crash and a small polite commotion, and in the 11 seconds while the room's attention went to the noise, 2 people who had been standing near that door were no longer standing near it. The service corridor was hot and smelled of butter. Carmine was waiting at the end of it with his jacket off and a canvas roll under his arm. "Kitchen's ours for 22 minutes, he said. "After that, the pastry crew comes back, and they're not on the payroll." 22, boss. Not 23. Alexander looked at Clara. "Timing. 22 is enough," she said. "If the 3rd door is where he says it is." The dumbwaiter was behind a rack of sheet pans. It was not a dumbwaiter. It was a 19th century bank elevator with a modern car dropped into the shaft, and it went down past 3 floors that officially did not exist. Door 1 was a modern electromagnetic lock on a 180-year-old iron gate. Clara did not touch the lock. She unscrewed the plate on the antique gate's own dead mechanism, which nobody had considered a security feature since Grover Cleveland, and lifted the original iron bar out of its seat, and the whole gate swung open on the hinge side while the magnetic lock stayed shut and satisfied. 2 minutes, 10 seconds. Door 2 was a combination dial, and Clara opened it the way her father would have been ashamed to admit was possible. She put her ear against it, turned it very slowly, and listened, because the man who installed it had never once had it serviced, and the wheel pack was worn enough to talk. 6 minutes, 40. Door 3 was the one with the deliberate flaw. It was a monster, a modern composite door with a 9-pin electronic sequence, and Clara knelt in front of it and did not go near the keypad. She took a jeweler's screwdriver from the canvas roll and removed 4 screws from the hinge side edge plate, and there, under the plate, exactly where a page of a smuggled journal had said it would be for 5 years, was a linkage pin sitting 1 millimeter out of true. She looked at it for a moment. Then she pressed the flat of her thumb against it, the way you would press a case back. "Hello, Dad," she said. The pin dropped. The whole electronic sequence disengaged, because a lock is only ever as clever as the metal behind it, and the door came open under her hand. 11 minutes, 20. Door 4 was not locked at all. That was the thing that frightened her most. A man who does not lock the last door is a man who does not believe anyone will ever reach it. Clara pushed it open. The room beyond was low and white and lit like an operating theater. There was a cot in the corner, with a folded blanket squared off at the foot of it. There was a shelf of reference books, most of them in German. There was a workbench 30 feet long, and every tool on it was laid out in obsessively straight rows. And at the bench, with a loop screwed into his right eye, a silver-haired man was bent over a brass gear assembly, humming. 4 bars, over and over, slow and unhurried. E-flat, G, B-flat, C. Clara Hayes stood in the doorway in a dress the color of deep water and could not make a sound. Her father lifted his head, the way a man does when the light changes. He turned around. The lope fell out of his eye and clattered on the bench and rolled, and neither of them moved to catch it, and Thomas Hayes stood up out of his chair very slowly, as though standing too fast might wake him. "Clara," he said, and then his face came apart. She crossed that room without any memory of crossing it. He was so thin. That was the thing she could never afterward describe to anybody, how thin he was through the shoulders, and how hard he held on anyway, one hand pressed to the back of her head like she was 9 years old and had fallen off something. "I knew," he said, into her hair. "I knew. The bad ratios. I knew if anyone ever came, it would be you. Because nobody else on God's earth would notice. Nobody else would care." "Check the wear," Clara said, wrecked. "You wrote check the wear on everything. You checked it." "I checked it." From the doorway, Alexander Romano said quietly, "Sir, I am very sorry. We have 9 minutes." Thomas Hayes looked over his daughter's shoulder at the man in the doorway, and his eyes went hard and clear, in a way Clara remembered from the worst nights of her childhood. "You're Salvatore's boy." "I am." "Then you'll want the ledgers," her father said. "Second cabinet, behind the false back. I built it in the first year, and he watched me do it, and thought it was for tools." He was already moving, unsteady, gripping the bench. "Everything he's put in that vault upstairs for 5 years. I've kept a copy of the movements, dates, names, amounts. Every account he opened, I wrote the number on a gear. It's all in there, son, and I have been keeping it in the hope that one day I would meet somebody who could carry it out of this room." Alexander Romano stood very still for a second. Then he crossed the room in 4 strides and opened the second cabinet. They came up in the service elevator at 10:06 with 3 minutes to spare, and Thomas Hayes walked out through the kitchen of Cipriani Wall Street, wearing a borrowed dinner jacket 2 sizes too big and a caterer's lanyard, holding his daughter's arm. Nobody stopped them. Nobody looked twice at an old man on the arm of a young woman in an evening dress, because in a room of 500 people that is the most ordinary sight there is. The last thing Clara saw before the doors was Dominic Falcone on the marble steps, laughing at something a senator's wife had said, entirely at ease in the most beautiful room in America, with 4 levels of bedrock beneath him, and every single number written on a gear. The federal grand jury that had gone looking for the Romano family in the Hamptons found an empty vault and a great deal of dust. 11 days later, the same U.S. Attorney's Office received, through an intermediary in a law firm on Park Avenue, a box. Inside it were 4 bound ledgers in a narrow, forward-leaning hand, a 5-year record of movements, dates, amounts, and account numbers, and a signed statement from a British national describing 61 months of unlawful imprisonment in a chamber 7 levels beneath a landmarked building on Wall Street, with drawings, to scale. The indictment ran to 209 counts. They took Dominic Falcone on a Tuesday morning in February, in front of the building he had restored, and the photograph of it ran on the front page of every paper in New York, and the thing everybody remarked on afterward was that he did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life waiting to find out which door it would come through, and was mildly disappointed by the answer. It cost Alexander Romano a great deal. The box he sent to the U.S. attorney had been assembled by his own lawyers, and there were things in it that could not be separated from the Romano name without cutting, and he had made the decision not to cut. 3 of the family's holdings were surrendered. 2 men who had been with his father for 30 years chose to leave rather than testify to anything, and he let them go and paid their pensions. The empire that had been 60 seconds from ending in October ended anyway, in a slower and more orderly fashion, over the following 2 years. What was left at the end of it was a construction and property company in Queens that had been legitimate since 1958 and had always been the least interesting thing the family owned. Carmine Ricci ran the yard. He was 63 by then, and complained about the paperwork constantly, and was, by every account, extremely happy. Thomas Hayes spent 5 weeks in a hospital in Westchester, and then a long spring in a rented house on the Sound with his daughter, and did not touch a tool for 4 months. The first thing he made when he went back to the bench was a clock for the front hall. It kept poor time. He was delighted by this, and refused to correct it, and told anyone who asked that it was a deliberate flaw, and looked at Clara when he said it. In the autumn, they opened a shop on a side street in Cold Spring, New York, a small storefront with a bow window, gold lettering on the glass, and a bench in the back where 2 people worked with their heads down under bright lamps. Hayes and daughter, restoration and repair. It did not make much money. Neither of them cared. Clara turned 27 that year. She had a bad month in November, around the 17th, and her father sat up with her, and neither of them said very much, and that was the last bad November there was. The bell over the door rang on a Saturday in March. Clara did not look up right away. She had a chronograph in pieces, and a lever balanced on a pin, and no free hands. "1 moment," she said. "Take your time," said a voice she had not heard in 11 months. "I'm told patience is the whole job." She set the lever down with a great deal more care than it required. Alexander Romano stood inside the door with his hands in the pockets of an overcoat, and he looked tired, and older, and considerably less expensive than the last time she had seen him. "You didn't call," Clara said. "You told me not to." "I told you not to call." She came out from behind the bench, wiping her fingers on a cloth. "I have been standing in this shop for 11 months, Mr. Romano, waiting for a man clever enough to work out the difference." Something eased in his face, the first thing she had ever seen ease in it. "It took me a while," he admitted. "It took you 11 months. There was a good deal to unwind." He looked around the little shop, the window, the wall of case clocks all disagreeing gently about the time, the gold lettering thrown backward across the floorboards by the afternoon light. "It's finished now, all of it. There is a company in Queens that pours concrete and pays its taxes, and there is nothing else. There is nothing left of it for anybody to be afraid of." "Is that a complaint?" "It's an application," said Alexander Romano. From the back room, without looking up from his bench, Thomas Hayes said, "Ask him what he thinks a lock is for." Clara laughed. She could not help it. Alexander turned toward the doorway, entirely at a loss, and said, "I'm sorry, sir. You heard me." Alexander looked at Clara, Clara raised her eyebrows and offered him nothing whatsoever. To keep people out, he said. Wrong, said the old man from the back, still not looking up. Any fool can weld a box shut. He set down his tweezers and turned on his stool and looked at the man in the doorway of his shop for a long moment. A lock is built to wait, Thomas Hayes said. It waits for the one person who knows the right question, and when that person finally comes, however long it takes, however many years, it opens like a door in a friend's house. He picked up his tweezers again. Hang your coat up, he said. You're letting the heat out. 25 of the most brilliant men in the world stood in front of that vault, and every one of them tried to force it. A woman nobody had bothered to look at for 3 months walked up and asked it a question. That is the whole of the story. It always was.